story. The country's vaccination drive is, of course, in full swing now, but hesitancy remains a big challenge. The conversation has been moving on to whether vaccination should be made mandatory in certain spheres. Should it be compulsory? But what are the constitutional implications of such suggestions? Let's discuss this further with human rights lawyer Ann-Suhet Kamffer. And good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I'm just going to start at a broad level. A couple of things top of mind. There's the whole thing of making COVID-19 vaccines compulsory, which is still a suggestion, according to the Health Minister last Friday, Dr. Joe Phaahla, that government has received that suggestion. But on the other hand, there's also the case of enforcing COVID-19 passports. Now, when you look at these things, one begins to wonder, how do they intersect with human rights law?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. A compulsory vaccination will be possible if the government sets out explicit parameters whereby this vaccination will then be necessary and proportionate in the interest of health and safety, and if it is to ensure that the state is fulfilling its positive obligation to protect the right to life. So from a public health perspective, a compulsory vaccination would be beneficial. However, we need to ask ourselves the question that if forcing an individual to receive the vaccination will interfere with any of the rights that the individual may have. There are three elements that we usually consider to come to the conclusion on whether or not such mandatory vaccinations will interfere on any rights. And that is, for instance, is the vaccination necessary? It must be in accordance with the law, and it must be in line with a legitimate aim. Therefore, in this instance, it is quite a concern that there may be interference with human rights in this instance, but there is also the possibility that the limitation of a human right is justifiable on certain grounds here.
Yeah, well, after all, I guess maybe some people say we're dealing with a pandemic, but also I'm wondering about the recently enforced POPI Act, you know, the Protection of Privacy Information Act, because many people's health conditions are a matter of confidentiality between me and my doctor, between you and your doctor. And now, if people are going to be forced to be walking around and with COVID-19 passports and everywhere, how does that get affected? I mean, my privacy now is affected.
You're 100% right. Section 12 of the Constitution makes provision for the right of freedom and security of a person. This right to freedom also includes then my right to security. Section 12(2) more specifically provides that every person has a right to bodily and psychological integrity. Therefore, if we consider the new POPI Act, is there an element where the POPI Act may interfere with, you know, your right to privacy, your right to freedom, etc.? However, we need to understand and we need to be very clear that no right is one-dimensional. No right is absolute. There are instances, it's provided for in Section 36 of the Constitution, where you can limit or where your rights can be limited, subject thereto that the grounds be justified. Limitations for these grounds are, you know, for example, the nature of the right of the limitation and the importance of such limitation. Are there any less restrictive measures that we can consider as opposed to, you know, mandatory vaccinations for people? Though this is unfortunately where the proverbial scale of justice fits in, that one person's individual right and the right of a community or the right of the public, which one weighs more? There was a 2009 court case. It was the Minister of Health in the province of the Western Cape versus Goliath and others, where the court actually compelled the surviving respondents to receive treatment for tuberculosis at the time, due to the fact that their treatment would have been to the public benefit and in the interest of the public. Therefore, we need to understand that there have been similar court cases, and there are precedents where the court has said, but the public interest weighs more or outweighs the interest of an individual. So your right, your individual right to privacy, your individual right to freedom or your individual right to security needs to be taken into consideration of the scales of justice as opposed to the interest of the public.
Community interest. You mentioned the constitutional rights of people, like right to association, freedom of expression, right to religion, my religious beliefs. I hear reports now and again about people saying, no, I'm not going to take the COVID-19 vaccine because my religion does not allow me. How could that play out? Because a whole religious community, which is more than one individual, could challenge such an enforcement, couldn't they?
They could definitely. We're experiencing a lot of inquiries about people saying, but I have medical reasons, I have religious beliefs that, prohibit me from obtaining or receiving the COVID-19 vaccination. So definitely there are restrictive measures for religious beliefs. If you can't force someone to get the COVID-19 vaccination if it is against their religious beliefs. And we've had numerous instances in labor law, in companies where people and employers wish to try and have a mandatory vaccination system in place in the company. But unfortunately, if a person is going to refuse the COVID-19 vaccination on the basis of a constitutional or a religious belief, then that employer and the people surrounding you will need to find, alternative accommodations, and will need to try and find as much as possible, as many possible resolutions possible to accommodate all parties.
It's going to be interesting. Yeah, sorry to come in there, and just we run out of time now.
No
Ann-Suhet Kamffer, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out on compulsory vaccinations, how companies are going to deal with it, and the intersection with people's rights. You can't just fire anybody, I guess, if they're trying to protect their own rights. And government is currently considering the issue of compulsory vaccinations, and there's that whole issue of COVID-19 passports. Thank you very much for your insights. And time, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to be discussed in this ongoing debate about mandatory vaccinations and, of course, the need for those COVID-19 vaccines.